A cold, metallic gray dawn broke over the Rhine on March 6, 1945, revealing a city of ghosts. Cologne, once a proud medieval metropolis, was now a jagged silhouette of shattered spires and skeletal buildings, cloaked in the acrid smoke of 1,000 fires. Into this surreal landscape of rubble-choked streets and gaping cellars rumbled the machines of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division. Among them was the M4A3 Sherman tank Eagle 7, commanded by 21-year-old Sergeant Clarence Smoyer. The crew, gunner Corporal John DeRiggi, driver Corporal Milton Buss, loader William Buck Rogers, and Homer gunner Doc Davis, was tense but focused. They were veterans of the brutal Hurtgenforest and the Ardennes, but a city fight was a different kind of nightmare. Every pile of rubble could hide a Panzerfaust team. Every dark window could conceal a sniper. Every tunnel and sewer, the infamous Mausgänge or mouse paths, allowed German defenders to appear behind them. Their immediate objective was to push through the southern districts toward the city center, the Domviertel, linking up with other elements of the Spearhead Division. The air crackled with sporadic small arms fire and the distant crump of artillery. The advance was cautious, methodical, a deadly game of clearing intersections supported by infantry. The sheer scale of destruction was disorienting. Then, the radio in Smoyer's tank crackled with a terse, urgent report from the spearhead of F Company, several blocks ahead. Enemy armor sighted. 2 Shermans hit. It's a Panther. Repeat, a Panther in the open near the Cathedral Square. A chill that had nothing to do with the March air went through the crew of Eagle 7. The German Panther tank was the beast they all feared. Its long 75mm gun could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor like paper at ranges where the Sherman's own gun was nearly useless. The report of 2 already killed friends confirmed their worst fears. They were rolling into an ambush laid by one of the most formidable tanks of the war. Sergeant Smoyer ordered driver Milton Buss to slow their advance, using the husk of a bombed-out tram as cover. Through his periscope, he scanned the chaotic vista of the Abramsallee, a broad avenue leading toward their fate. The sense of dread was palpable inside the Sherman. They all knew the grim statistics, the tankers' black humor about their own vehicles being Ronsons for how easily they caught fire. Their trusty Sherman had gotten them this far, but facing a Panther in the confines of a city street where flanking maneuvers were nearly impossible felt like a death sentence. The crew fell silent, each man locked in his own thoughts, checking and rechecking his station. Buck Rogers nervously tapped a fresh armor-piercing round. The radio chatter painted a desperate picture. The Panther was expertly positioned, covering a key intersection near the towering, scarred form of the Cologne Cathedral. It had chosen a perfect killing zone. American infantry was pinned down, and any tank that tried to rush the square would be exposed in the open for a deadly point-blank shot. The mission to secure the cathedral, a symbolic prize of immense propaganda value, was now stalled by a single steel predator. As Smoyer weighed their limited options, the voice of his platoon leader came through, assigning them to support the attempt to dislodge the Panther. They were being sent into the Dragon's Den. But just as Buss eased the Sherman forward again, a sudden sharp movement to their left caught Smoyer's eye. A lone figure, not in uniform, darted from a ruined doorway, clutching not a weapon, but a large, boxy movie camera. He scrambled up a pile of rubble for a better vantage point, seemingly oblivious to the danger. It was a surreal moment of absurdity amidst the tension of impending combat. The man was later identified as Corporal Jim Bates, a U.S. Army Signal Corps cameraman. His presence was a twist none of them expected, a silent witness documenting their potential last moments. Smoyer realized with a jolt that their duel with the Panther, whether they lived or died, was not just a tactical engagement anymore. It was about to become a filmed record of the war's brutal intimacy, and the whole world might one day watch. The metallic taste of fear that Sergeant Smoyer and his crew felt upon hearing Panther was a direct product of a painful, years-long deficit. Their trusty M4 Sherman, the workhorse of the Allied armies, was tragically outclassed by German heavy armor. Its 75mm gun struggled to penetrate the frontal armor of Panthers and Tigers except at suicidally close ranges or with perfect flanking shots, while the German 88mm guns could knock out Shermans from distances at which they were essentially blind. American tank crews grimly joked they needed 5 Shermans to kill 1 Panther, one to draw its fire while the others maneuvered. The horrific losses in the Ardennes, where Shermans burned like torches in the snowy forests, were the final bloody argument that could no longer be ignored by top brass. The need had been identified years earlier, but the solution, the T-26E3, soon to be dubbed the M26 Pershing, was mired in a bureaucratic and doctrinal quagmire. Senior commanders, including the influential General Leslie McNair, head of Army Ground Forces, stubbornly clung to the philosophy of mobility over armor, and the flawed belief that tank destroyers, not heavy tanks, should engage enemy armor. This, combined with production prioritization for proven designs like the Sherman and logistical concerns over shipping heavier vehicles, delayed the Pershing's deployment until the war's final months. While American industry could build a staggering number of Shermans, the men inside them paid the price for this doctrinal inertia with their lives. The first 20 of these long-awaited super tanks finally arrived in Antwerp in late January 1945, part of the Zebra mission, a top-secret field test under actual combat conditions. They were rushed to the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions. When Sergeant Smoyer's crew was ordered to swap their familiar Sherman with one of these strange new beasts, their reaction was a mix of awe and suspicion. The Pershing was a different animal, lower, heavier, and armed with a powerful 90mm gun that finally promised parity with the German 88. Its frontal armor was thick enough to theoretically withstand a Panther's shot. As they familiarized themselves with the new machine at a muddy depot behind the lines, a technical sergeant from the Zebra mission team gave them a rushed briefing, pointing out the strengths and, ominously, the teething issues. The tank felt more powerful, but also more complex and unproven. The twist came not from the tank itself, but from the manner of its deployment. There was no time for extensive training. The push into Germany was accelerating, and Cologne was the next major objective. Their Pershing, serial number 26, was not assigned to replace a lost tank in their own familiar platoon. Instead, Sergeant Smoyer's veteran crew was specifically chosen as a test crew for this new weapon system. They were to take it directly into combat, with engineers and observers monitoring its performance. The pressure was immense. They were no longer just soldiers fighting to survive and take an objective. They were now the frontline test pilots of the U.S. Army's belated answer to the Panther, carrying the hopes of every tank crew that had ever felt outgunned into the ruins of Cologne. Their first real combat test would not be on a training range, but in the shadow of a Gothic cathedral, against the very threat that had made their new tank necessary. The order to advance came with a grim clarity. Clear the path to the cathedral. From their position south of the inner city, Sergeant Smoyer's Pershing, now leading a small column of wary infantry and supporting Shermans, began its deliberate crawl into the heart of the ruins. The grand boulevards were transformed into deadly funnels, littered with the wreckage of streetcars, burned-out vehicles, and fallen masonry. Every intersection was a potential ambush point, requiring the tank to halt while infantry scouts, faces pale with tension, darted ahead to peer around corners. The distant silhouette of the Cologne Cathedral's twin spires, pockmarked by shellfire but still defiantly standing, served as their macabre navigational beacon. The German defense had devolved into a desperate, fragmented affair, a mix of disciplined paratroopers from the Fallschirmjäger and poorly trained but fanatical Volkssturm militia. They did not hold continuous lines. They infested the city like ghosts, using the vast network of cellars, shattered sewers, and connecting tunnels, the Moisgänger, to appear behind American lines, launch sudden attacks with Panzerfausts, and vanish again. The rumble of the Pershing's engine echoed ominously off the canyon walls of broken buildings, announcing their presence to every hidden defender. Inside Eagle 7, the atmosphere was one of hyper-alert claustrophobia. Smoyer and Dirigi scanned their periscopes over a nightmarish 360-degree panorama. Driver Buss inched the 46-ton tank forward, avoiding larger piles of rubble that could hide mines or immobilize them. The sheer psychological weight of the environment was exhausting. Danger could come from a fourth-story window, a cellar grate, or from around the next blind turn. Their progress was measured in yards, not miles. They fought a series of brutal micro-engagements. A Panzerfaust team would erupt from a basement, fire, and scramble away before the Pershing's coaxial machine gun could cut them down. Snipers' bullets sparked off their thick armor. The supporting infantry, grateful for the heavy tank's presence, worked in tandem, clearing buildings floor by floor. The radio was a constant stream of tense updates from other elements of F Company, trying to press toward the cathedral square from different avenues. The specific threat, however, remained ominously consistent. The Panther was still there, holding the key approach routes hostage. Then, as Smoyer's column neared the Marienstrasse, a street leading toward the open plaza in front of the cathedral, the radio chatter turned frantic. 2 Shermans from another platoon had attempted to probe the square. A sharp, high-velocity crack was heard, followed by the telltale sound of armor being pierced. One Sherman was instantly engulfed in flames. The other, crippled and smoking, was frantically reversing to escape. The Panther had struck again. It was clear the German tank commander was a seasoned veteran, holding a perfect defensive position with overlapping fields of fire. For Smoyer, the abstract threat was now a visceral, immediate reality just a few hundred yards ahead. He ordered Buss to halt the Pershing behind the substantial corner of a bombed-out bank building, providing temporary cover. They had reached the edge of the killing zone. The twist came not from the enemy, but from their own command. A new crackling order came through. They were not to wait for a coordinated assault. Command, aware of the symbolic importance of the cathedral and the propaganda value of its capture, wanted the Panther neutralized immediately. Furthermore, they were informed that the Signal Corps cameraman, Jim Bates, had managed to position himself in a ruined upper-floor apartment with a direct, albeit distant, view of the square. The upcoming duel would not just be fought for a street intersection, it would be fought on film for history. The pressure on the young crew spiked exponentially. They were to advance into a proven tank killer's sights with the eyes of the world figuratively upon them, carrying the hopes of a new tank doctrine on their shoulders. From their temporary shelter behind the bank's shattered stone facade, Sergeant Smoyer and his crew assessed the nightmare through periscopes and vision slits. The broad, open expanse of the cathedral square was a killing floor. To their left, near the base of the immense scarred Gothic cathedral, one M4 Sherman burned fiercely, thick black smoke coiling into the gray sky. A second Sherman sat crippled and silent about 50 yards away, a gaping hole visible in its side. The source of the destruction was unmistakable. Approximately 120 yards directly ahead, partially concealed in the shadow of a ruined department store on the opposite side of the square, sat the low, sleek silhouette of the German Panther OSF-A. Its long 75mm KWK-42 gun was pointed ominously toward the approaches, its commander undoubtedly scanning for the next target. The tank was positioned with tactical brilliance, covering the main entry streets while using the rubble for flank protection. A direct advance into the square would mean exposing the Pershing's frontal armor to a point-blank shot from a gun known to penetrate even their thicker glacis plate. The air crackled with tension and the smell of burning oil and cordite. American infantry, pinned down in doorways and behind low walls at the edges of the plaza, exchanged sporadic, ineffective rifle fire with unseen German troops in the buildings surrounding the Panther. The situation was a stalemate with a timer. Every minute allowed more German reinforcements to infiltrate through the ruins, and every minute the symbolic heart of Cologne remained in enemy hands was a propaganda defeat. Inside Eagle 7, the crew worked with a quiet, focused intensity. Gunner Corporal John DeRigi methodically tracked the Panther through his telescopic sight, murmuring range and adjustments. 120 yards. Hold steady. Loader Buck Rogers had a 90mm armor-piercing T-33 round ready in the breech, his hands steady despite the adrenaline. Driver Milton Buss kept the engine idling, his foot hovering over the clutch, ready to move on command. Sergeant Smoyer's mind raced through their dismal options. A frontal duel was suicidal. Pulling back was not in order. They needed an angle, a moment of distraction. It was then that a flicker of movement high in a bomb-damaged apartment building to their right caught his eye. For a split second, he feared a sniper or a forward observer. Then he recognized the bulky shape of a 35mm movie camera on a tripod and the figure of Corporal Jim Bates behind it, calmly panning across the scene. The surreal reality hit Smoyer anew. Their potential deaths were being framed for a newsreel. But this observation also sparked a realization. Bates' elevated position offered a different perspective. Risking a quick hushed call on the infantry radio net, Smoyer managed to get a relay to Bates. The cameraman, showing incredible coolness, briefly shifted his lens and used hand signals toward a narrower, rubble-choked side street that branched off to the right before reaching the square. It was not a main avenue, but it might, just might, offer a flanking approach. At that moment, the radio crackled with the voice of their battalion commander, monitoring the situation. The order was clear and left no room for debate. Eagle 7, you were the only heavy asset on scene. Neutralize that Panther. Clear the square for the infantry. The weight of command, the eyes of the camera, and the lives of the pinned-down men coalesced into a single, inescapable mandate. They had to fight. The unexpected twist came not from the enemy, but from their own machine. As Buss prepared to edge the Pershing backward to attempt the flanking route, a sharp metallic ping echoed through the hull, followed by the distinct ricochet whine of a high-velocity round striking their frontal armor and deflecting upward. A hidden German anti-tank gun or a second, unseen tank had just taken a shot at them from a different direction. They were not just in a duel, they were in a trap. The Panther on the square was the anvil, and now another threat was revealed as the hammer. The sharp ping of the ricochet against their hull acted like a bucket of ice water, shocking the crew of Eagle 7 into hyper-awareness. They were not merely staring down the barrel of a Panther, they were caught in a crossfire. Sergeant Smoyer barked, "Driver, reverse, now, use the building for cover." Milton Buss threw the Pershing into reverse, the tank lurching backward until the corner of the bank building fully shielded them from the direction of the new, unknown threat. For a terrifying moment, they were blind to both enemies. The radio erupted with confused reports from the infantry, trying to pinpoint the source of the second shot. It became clear. A well-concealed German anti-tank gun, likely a PaK-40, was positioned down a side street to the southeast, covering the main approach. The Panther on the square was the bait in a deadly pincer. Any attempt to engage one would expose their flank to the other. Smoyer's initial thought of a head-on rush was now completely impossible. They needed a third option, and fast. He recalled the cameraman's gestured suggestion of the narrow side street. Studying his map under the dim red light of the turret, he saw it. The Marienstrasse did indeed have a smaller feeder lane, the Trankgasse, which doglegged behind the row of buildings facing the square. If it wasn't blocked by rubble, it could theoretically allow them to emerge much closer to the Panther's flank, potentially from behind the very department store the German tank was using. It was a huge if. The lane would be tight, potentially mined, and they would be moving blind, with infantry unable to fully support them in the confined space. Yet it was the only move left on the board. Smoyer made the call. He relayed the basic plan to the platoon leader and requested suppressing fire from the infantry and the remaining functional Shermans toward both known enemy positions to mask the sound of their movement. The crew's preparation was a symphony of deliberate, rehearsed motions under extreme pressure. Buck Rogers cleared the AP round from the breech and loaded a high-explosive shell first. "Switching to HE, Sarge," he confirmed. The logic was cold and smart. Their first shot upon rounding the corner might be at an infantry position, a barricade, or the building corner itself to blind the Panther. An AP round would be useless for that. Gunner John DeRigi double-checked his sight, whispering the elevation adjustment for a mere 100-yard shot. Driver Buss mentally prepared for the most delicate driving of his life, navigating a colossal tank through a canyon of unstable rubble. The tension was suffocating. Just as Smoyer was about to give the order to move, the intercom crackled with an urgent low voice from bow gunner Homer Davis. "Sergeant, I've got eyes on the second gun. Through the rubble, down that side street. It's a Pack 40, crew of 4. They're reloading. They're focused on the main road. They don't see us here." This was the critical twist. The anti-tank gun's position, while dangerous, had a fatal flaw. Its narrow field of fire was fixed on the expected American advance from the south. Their current hiding place, obscured by the bank's corner, was in its blind spot. More importantly, the gun crew's attention was firmly elsewhere. Smoyer immediately revised the plan. They wouldn't just sneak away. "DeRigi, traverse left, target, anti-tank gun, HE, 1 shot, then we move, fast." The Pershing's massive turret whined as it swung a few degrees. DeRigi locked on to the partially visible German crew. One well-placed 90mm HE shell could turn the Pack 40 into scrap and erase the pincer's second jaw before their real maneuver even began. The success of their entire flanking attack now hinged on this single, unplanned preliminary shot. Corporal John DeRigi's crosshairs settled on the German anti-tank crew. "On target," he murmured. Sergeant Smoyer gave the order, "Fire." The Pershing's hull rocked with the deafening blast of the 90mm gun. The high-explosive shell screamed across the short distance and detonated in a cataclysmic explosion directly beside the Pack 40. When the smoke and debris cleared, the gun was obliterated, its crew dead or fleeing. The immediate threat to their flank was gone. Without a moment's hesitation, Smoyer ordered, "Driver, forward, Trankgasse, now." Milton Buss guided the heavy Pershing into the narrow, rubble-filled lane. It was a torturous passage. The tank's sides scraped against fallen masonry, and the crew held their breath, expecting a mine blast or a Panzerfaust strike from a hidden window. Infantrymen darted ahead, clearing doorways. After what felt like an eternity, they approached the lane's end, which opened onto a smaller plaza behind the department store shielding the Panther. Smoyer's heart pounded. They had achieved the unthinkable, a flanking position. As the Pershing's nose edged past the final corner of a building, the entire rear and left side of the Panther, still focused on the main square, came into view at a mere 100 yards. It was a perfect, fleeting shot. "Gunner, Sabbat, tank, traverse left," Smoyer yelled. DeRigi already had the target, his scope fixed on the Panther's vulnerable side armor below the turret. Buck Rogers slammed the long dart-like HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing round into the breach. "Up!" he shouted. In the same instant, the German tank commander, perhaps sensing movement in his peripheral vision or alerted by the infantry, began to frantically traverse his massive turret to face the new threat. "Fire!" Smoyer commanded. The first 90mm round hit the Panther with a blinding flash and a sharp clang, striking the turret ring and jamming the mechanism. The German turret stopped, frozen at an angle. The Panther was wounded, but not dead. Its gunner, unable to bring the main gun to bear, began spraying the Pershing with the coaxial machine gun, rounds sparking harmlessly off the thick frontal armor. "AP, load AP," Smoyer ordered. Rogers ejected the spent casing and loaded a standard armor-piercing round with practiced speed. "Up!" DeRigi, calmed as a surgeon, adjusted his aim slightly to the Panther's hull. "Fire!" The second shot was a thunderclap of finality. The tungsten cord projectile pierced the Panther's side armor with ease, tearing through the fighting compartment in a storm of red-hot metal shrapnel. A split second later, a third AP round followed into the same gaping hole for good measure. Inside the German tank, ammunition and fuel ignited. A jet of flame shot from the hatches, followed by a roiling fireball that engulfed the rear of the vehicle. The duel was over in less than 30 seconds. As the smoke cleared, the victorious but stunned crew of Eagle 7 watched two surviving German crewmen, their uniforms on fire, stumble from the inferno and collapse on the cobblestones. The sudden silence was only broken by the crackle of flames and the distant sounds of battle elsewhere. Then Sergeant Smoyer's gaze drifted upward. There, in the bomb-damaged apartment, Corporal Jim Bates was still filming, patiently panning his camera from the burning Panther to the victorious Pershing. The crew realized with a jolt that their every move had been captured. They had not only won a desperate tactical fight, but also created a piece of cinematic history. The unexpected twist was the profound normalcy that followed. There was no cheering, no celebration inside the turret. Buck Rogers simply muttered, "God Almighty," and began preparing another round. The job wasn't finished. They had just slain the dragon guarding the square, but the city was still a battlefield. Their place in history was already secure on film, but their immediate war was about to push deeper into the ruins. The sudden vacuum of silence after the roaring climax of the duel was almost as disorienting as the battle itself. Inside the Pershing, the crew moved through a well-rehearsed post-engagement drill, their actions automatic, but underscored by a deep, trembling adrenaline crash. "Check for damage," Smoyer ordered, his own voice sounding oddly distant. Driver Milton Buss reported no issues with the controls. The hull was intact, save for the glancing blow earlier. Gunner John DeRiggi and loader Buck Rogers safetied the gun and began a quick inventory of remaining ammunition, their ears still ringing. The immediate, overwhelming feeling was not triumph, but profound relief at a sharp awareness of their exposure. They were sitting in the open, near a burning tank that could cook off its remaining ammunition at any second. "Driver, move us behind that wall, left side," Smoyer commanded, directing the Pershing to a more covered position where they could observe the square without being a stationary target. As they settled, the reality of their achievement began to sink in, filtered through the lens of pure survival. They had done it. The monster that had held an entire company at bay for hours was a blazing funeral pyre. On the radio, the voice of their platoon leader crackled with uncharacteristic excitement. "Eagle 7, good effect on target. Infantry is moving up. Secure the area." Around them, GIs from the 36th Armored Infantry Regiment began to emerge from their hiding places, advancing across the square with renewed vigor, their path now clear. A medical team rushed to the smoldering Panther, but the two crewmen who had escaped were already dead. The burning hulk of the German tank would illuminate the square for the next 8 hours. Corporal Jim Bates, having captured the entire film, now descended from his perch with his precious film canisters. He approached Eagle 7, signaling to the crew. Smoyer opened his hatch, the cold air hitting his sweat-drenched face. Bates, grinning, gave a thumbs up. "Got it all, Sarge, every second. This is going home." He then asked the crew to pose briefly by their tank, with the cathedral and the burning Panther in the background. The resulting photographs, men in grimy tanker helmets looking more weary than victorious, would become iconic. For Smoyer and his men, this brief interlude as movie stars was a surreal intrusion. Their war was not about glory. It was about the next street, the next ambush. As they posed, a fuel truck miraculously navigated the rubble to refill them, and an ordnance team delivered a fresh crate of 90mm shells. The Pershing had proven itself decisively. The engineers observing the Zebra mission would later note in their reports the flawless performance of both the gun and the armor. The square was quickly transformed into a forward staging point. However, the twist in this moment of hard-won success was psychological and subtle. As Buck Rogers lifted a new shell into the tank, he paused and looked at the blackened skeletal remains of the Panther. "You know," he said quietly to DeRiggi, "that could have been us."
The sentiment echoed in the hushed interior. Their victory did not feel like the defeat of an abstract enemy, but like a narrow escape from a mirrored fate. They had not conquered a Panther. They had cheated the same brutal equation that had killed the crews of the two Shermans and now this German tank. The success was sobering, not exhilarating. The order to move out came within the hour. The cathedral was secure, but Cologne was not. The mission continued. The adrenaline faded into deep fatigue, and the legendary duel became just another entry in their long, grim logbook. Yet, in Bates's film canisters, their 30 seconds of war were already immortalized, destined to outlive them all.
The lull following the duel at the cathedral was over almost before it began. For the crew of Eagle 7, there was no time to rest on their laurels. Within an hour, with the square secured by infantry, they received new orders. Continue the advance eastward, clearing the maze of streets towards the Rhine River bridges. The Pershing, now with a tangible aura of invincibility among the infantry, once again became the spearhead. But the character of the fight had changed. The open, dramatic duel was replaced by a grinding, nerve-shredding crawl through a claustrophobic labyrinth. The grand boulevards gave way to narrower residential and commercial streets, even more choked with debris. Every shattered window and dark cellar door was a potential muzzle flash. German resistance, though fragmented, became more desperate and unpredictable. Isolated squads of Volkssturm and Hitlerjugend, sometimes armed nothing but Panzerfausts and fanaticism, launched suicidal attacks only to melt back into the ruins. Snipers took shots from impossible perches. The progress was exhausting, measured in single buildings cleared by the accompanying infantry. Inside the Pershing, the crew operated in a state of hyper-vigilant fatigue. The adrenaline from the duel had drained away, leaving behind gritty-eyed concentration. Sergeant Smoyer's voice was hoarse from constant commands. Durigi's neck ached from swiveling in the tight periscope. Buss's hands were cramped on the controls. They were no longer just tankers. They were a moving bunker, a psychological anchor for the infantry, and a prime target all at once. The incident occurred as they inched through a tight intersection near the Hüllmarkt, a historic square now unrecognizable under rubble. The supporting infantry was momentarily pinned down by machine gun fire from a half-collapsed hotel on the left flank. As Smoyer transversed the turret to bring the coaxial machine gun to bear, a sharp, familiar crack of a high-velocity gun echoed from a parallel street ahead, followed by the screech of a ricochet off a building corner just meters from their hull. "Contact front! Tank!" Smoyer yelled. Everyone braced. A German tank was nearby, but the convoluted urban canyon made visual identification impossible. Through the dust and smoke, they could only see the muzzle flash's origin, a side street about 150 yards ahead, partially obscured by a collapsed facade. The German tank fired again, this time hitting the rubble pile in front of them, sending a shower of brick and stone over the Pershing's bow. The crew of Eagle 7 reacted instantly, sliding into their combat rhythm. Durigi searched frantically for a target in his scope, but saw only shifting shadows and dust. Buck Rogers had an AP round ready. The supporting infantry, taking advantage of the distraction, began assaulting the hotel to eliminate the machine gun. In that moment of chaotic stalemate, with two armored vehicles blind to each other but separated by mere yards of rubble, the unexpected twist occurred. A frantic voice came over the radio on an open Allied frequency. "Cease fire! Cease fire on the intersection! We have friendly units in the area!" For a heart-stopping second, Smoyer wondered if they were mistakenly engaging another American tank. But the ballistic crack of the next incoming round was unmistakably German. However, the warning had a bizarre effect. The German tank, having perhaps intercepted the same radio call or misinterpreting the source of the new infantry assault, abruptly ceased fire. An eerie silence fell over the intersection, broken only by the distant sounds of other battles. The German tank, still unseen, had seemingly disengaged. It was a temporary, bewildering reprieve bought by confusion and radio waves.
The Panzer IV wasn't done with them, but it had chosen to slip back into the urban shadows, setting the stage for a more deliberate and deadly confrontation in the next shattered block.
The ghostly Panzer IV that had struck and vanished now became an obsession for the crew of Eagle 7. The brief, terrifying exchange had left them rattled, operating on frayed nerves. They knew the German tank was still out there in the skeletal cityscape, a patient hunter like themselves. Advancing with even greater caution, they pushed eastward, the accompanying infantry now scouring upper floors and rooftops for telltale signs, tracks in the dust, a hint of exhaust, the glint of a periscope. The tension was a live wire. Every pile of rubble looked like a hull-down position, every dark alley mouth a potential firing lane. Sergeant Smoyer coordinated closely with the infantry platoon leader, developing a rudimentary signal system, hand gestures from a point man to direct the Pershing's turret toward potential threats. The sound of their own engine was a liability, masking the possible startup of a Maybach engine nearby. After nearly an hour of tense stop-and-search progress, they reached a wider junction where several streets converged near the ruins of the Gürzenich Hall. It was here, through the dust-choked air, that the bow gunner, Homer Davis, spotted it. "Tank, 2 o'clock, behind the rubble of that corner building," he called over the intercom, his voice tight. Everyone stiffened. DeRiggy traversed the turret smoothly. There, partially sheltered by the collapsed front wall of a 3-story stone building, was the Panzer IV Osf H. Only its commander's cupola and the upper half of its turret and gun were visible, perfectly using the rubble as a berm. It was a superb defensive position, covering 3 approach routes. The German tank was silent, its engine off, waiting. It hadn't seen them yet. Smoyer analyzed the problem in seconds. A direct shot was impossible. The heavy stone rubble would deflect or absorb their round before it ever reached the tank's armor. A flanking maneuver was out. The surrounding streets were too exposed and likely covered by German infantry. They needed to destroy the tank's cover or force it to move. "Gunner, HE, target the building corner above the tank. We're going to bring the house down," Smoyer ordered, a desperate plan forming. Buck Rogers swapped the AP for a high-explosive shell. DeRiggy elevated his aim, targeting the already weakened junction where the building's surviving wall met the collapsed section directly over the German tank. "On target," he confirmed. "Fire!" The 90mm HE shell screamed across the 80-yard gap and struck the masonry with a deafening thunderclap explosion. A huge cloud of dust and debris erupted. As it cleared, they saw the structure groan and shift, but it held. The Panzer IV remained, its commander now visibly scrambling in his cupola. "Again, same spot," Smoyer barked. A second HE round impacted with devastating effect. This time, with a deep, grinding roar, several tons of stone, timber, and plaster sheared away from the main structure and collapsed directly onto the Panzer IV, entombing it in an avalanche of rubble. The German tank disappeared from view under the dust cloud. The crew of Eagle 7 waited, guns trained, expecting hatches to fly open or the engine to roar as it tried to reverse, but there was only settling dust and silence. The twist came minutes later, not from the tank, but from the ruins beside it. As American infantry moved in to secure the area, 4 dazed and dust-covered German soldiers emerged from a cellar entrance adjacent to the buried Panzer IV, their hands raised. They were the tank's crew. Interrogation revealed that after the first near miss at the previous intersection, they had withdrawn to this ideal position, but, fearing the infantry more than the tanks, had chosen to hide in the building's cellar for a brief rest, leaving their tank as a silent decoy. The collapsing building had trapped their vehicle, but saved their lives, burying the empty Panzer IV instead of them. The most dangerous tank in their sector was neutralized without firing a shot at an enemy crewman. The duel with the Panther was a clash of titans. The encounter with the Panzer IV was a victory of sheer dumb luck and miscommunication, a bizarre footnote to the day's legendary events. The fierce house-to-house fighting in Cologne continued for 2 more grueling days after the duel at the cathedral.
The crew of Eagle 7, operating on a mix of adrenaline, caffeine, and sheer will, pushed with the rest of the 3rd Armored Division toward the Rhine. Their Pershing, now battle-tested and respected, led several more assaults against stubborn pockets of resistance, its 90mm gun blasting holes in barricades and fortified buildings. The German defense, stripped of its heavy armor and compressed into a shrinking perimeter near the river, grew increasingly desperate but ultimately futile. On March 8, 1945, organized resistance in the city collapsed. The last German troops either surrendered, were captured, or fled across the wrecked Hohenzollern Bridge, which they then demolished. Cologne, Germany's 4th largest city and a major logistical hub, had fallen. For the men of the Spearhead Division, it was a monumental, hard-won victory. For Sergeant Smoyer and his crew, the immediate aftermath was a blur of exhaustion and routine. They checked their tank for the 100th time, performed maintenance on the gun, and finally caught a few hours of fitful sleep near their vehicle, the smell of smoke and death still hanging in the air. The Pershing had performed flawlessly, validating the years of delay and bureaucracy. It was no longer an experiment, it was a proven weapon of war. Yet for the men inside, their primary feeling was not of triumph, but of relief that they had survived another campaign. They were already thinking of the next river crossing, the next town, the next defensive line. The war was far from over. The true conclusion to their mission in Cologne, however, was not written in operational reports, but on celluloid. Corporal Jim Bates's film was quickly processed and sent up the chain. The footage of the Pershing's dramatic duel with the Panther, set against the iconic backdrop of the cathedral, was nothing short of cinematic gold for the Allied propaganda effort. It showcased American technical prowess, crew bravery, and decisive victory in the heart of a major German city. Within weeks, the clip was being shown in newsreels across the United States and to troops in the field, under titles like Spearhead in Cologne. Sergeant Clarence Smoyer, who had never sought fame, became an unwitting face of the armored forces. The twist of their story lay in this sudden, distant fame. While they continued the grim business of war, crossing the Rhine and fighting into the Ruhr pocket, their specific 30-second battle was being dissected by generals, celebrated by the public, and etched into the historical record. The intense personal terror they had experienced was transformed into a clean, heroic narrative for home consumption. The crew remained largely unaware of their growing legend, focused instead on the immediate dangers ahead. The fall of Cologne was a strategic milestone, but for them it was just another stop in a long, brutal journey. Only much later would they understand that their actions on March 6, 1945, captured so vividly by chance and a cameraman's nerve, had transcended the battle itself. They had provided the U.S. Army with its most iconic tank-versus-tank footage of the European War, a timeless document of skill, courage, and the terrifying intimacy of armored combat in the urban jungle.